to reject, but I hope you do not. And if you don't want to be caught in the recording, you can obviously just turn off your camera. So again, I'm Adam Strom. I'm the Executive Director of Reimagining Migration, and I'm really happy that my colleague Abir Shinawi is letting me do this. Abir's our program director. I assume Abir is out here this evening, and then we're going to be also, you're going to get to work with my colleague Sasha Guzman in a little bit. So Sasha's being kind and letting people in right now for me. So let me get us started. And I just want to say a couple things to get us started. That first of all, everything that Reimagining does in the classroom, all of our work with teachers in schools is really based on our framework. And so Reimagining's framework are really these questions, and we're thinking broadly about the young people that we're teaching, and what are the most important skills and ideas that we're looking for in a world on the move, and how should we teach about migration, and how do we create a learning environment that is powerful and supportive for all of our students. And that framework, you should know, is really developed primarily by my colleague Veronica Boyce-Mancia from Harvard Graduate School of Education's Project Zero, but really in conversation with Carola Suarez Orozco. Carola is now the executive director, the director of the Immigration Initiative at Harvard University. And so it's important to me that their names, right, that we associate with the work. So these are two really wonderful people who I admire greatly. So again, this is another piece for the chat, but or for your head, but the chat is good. I'd love to know, what do you want your students to understand about migration? Number one, and how would you like it to shape the way that they navigate the world? So what would you want your students to understand about migration? And how would you like it to shape the way that they navigate the world? Actually, just because it seems weird to have everybody muted for the whole time. Anybody want to just jump in really quickly? You can unmute and say something if you want. What about my good friend Larissa? I see you, Larissa. What do you think? What are you thinking, Larissa? What would you want your students to understand about migration?
It's a part of human experience throughout the history. So I think this is just integral to who we are as human beings. So this is the first thing that comes to my mind. And what would we like to, how we would like this to be, to shape the experiences of students in terms of navigating the world, I think is just to see the humanity in this experience and to help our students understand and really see the humans behind these experiences. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Larissa. And I think I have time for another voice. Anyone else want to just jump in? I know there are answers in the chat, but human voices are good. Well, I'm going to have to stop sharing to see what's in the chat. So hold on, and I will tell you. So Angie says that migration is important and necessary in this world. And Natalie says how migration relates to them and their story. Lisa says it's a natural response, just like animals that migrate their cycles, and there need to be safe havens for migrants, waiting for them to be part of that cycle. I love that. Fallon says migration is a gift. So there's wonderful pieces in the chat. So do make sure that you look and see. All right, I'm going to come back to the slides. And so as we start to think about our work in the classroom, there's some things that I think is really important. One is, it would be foolish to assume that, our work exists in isolation of the communities or the classrooms, right? And where we're existing. right? And I think sometimes that's a mistake. I think there's a lot of folks who work in the nonprofit educational space, and we think, oh, we've developed these awesome resources. But these awesome resources are only awesome when you're a teacher who's thinking about your students, who's thinking about what do you know about them? What do you know about their lives? What do you know about the community in which you're teaching? And what do you know about the communities in which your students are from? What's the culture of your school and your classroom, and how might that impact your pedagogy? And of course, what's a course in school in discipline that any of this is going to come up with? So I'm and I'm not going to talk all about those 4 elements, but I think it's important that you recognize that we really believe our work has to be culturally embedded. It's why we're not trying to hand everybody just a curriculum. This is something that, to me, if reimagining can do one thing, is that we would give you all a gift of helping you become great curators and great designers of curriculum, and we are offering a framework for you to start to think about it. So one way and one tool that you might use to get yourself thinking about your community and schools, we've created a culturally responsive teaching checklist. I'm going to have to do a little bit of navigation because my computer's deciding to misbehave this afternoon. So I'm going to drop this in. I'm going to drop this in the chat. But this culturally responsive teaching checklist is just designed to help you think about your own approaches to the classroom and how responsive are you being intentionally to your students' lives, right? In your students' identities, right? How is that shaping not only your decisions about what you teach, but how do you teach as well? So again, students first. That's piece number 1. Okay, computer, which was not meant as a bad joke. Number 2 is beyond just who we're teaching. It's what are the skills, the dispositions that we're really looking to try to inculcate. And again, Veronica was really thoughtful as we were thinking about these issues. And so really we put out 5 dispositions, 5 habits of mind is another way to think about them, that we think are really, really important when we're teaching about issues of migration. Number 1 is, how do we think about perspective taking, and how be very intentional to recognize our own perspectives and the perspective of others, and help us think a little bit about how actually our experiences with migration, whether it's our experiences or our family's experiences, might start to shape that. Number 2, how do we inquire about migration, and why does that matter? Because we're in a world of all kinds of viral myth and misinformation. So how can we help people make it their habit when they confront a story about migration, that they recognize that that's something that actually they need to know more about? And so how do we help them develop those inquiry skills, which is A, just good teaching, but B, it's particularly important, again, when there's so many myths and pieces of misinformation that floats around immigration. So for example, I'll choose one of the myths that just never goes away. There's always immigrants don't want to learn the language of the new country. Now, there's all kinds of research that says like 99% of immigrant children are like really excited to learn English. Doesn't matter. That misinformation just floats out there. So how do we help young people develop kind of the skills and the habits to do some inquiry so they don't just accept this stuff? Number 3, and this is particularly important, as migration diversifies our classroom communities, how do we be intentional about communication and building relationships across different culture, across different beliefs, across different histories? How can we be really intentional about that? And then part of this work, and we were always wondered, should this sit as a separate question or not? But how do we help students to recognize the differences in power and inequity in experiences of migration? And I think this is really important. So I'll speak personally around this. So, I mean, it's one thing, my family's story, my family's fled from Eastern Europe, Eastern European Jews, and one of them fled a pogrom, which was a violent attack. But they were able to get to the United States, and actually there were literally no laws about how many people could come from that part of the world where they were coming when they first arrived. Now think about how different that is than people who are fleeing violence in their own countries today, trying to arrive in the United States, or descendants of enslaved people who are forced to migrate to the United States. So when we're talking about migration, right, there are different power dynamics and different migration experiences. It's not just an immigration story, but migration simply means to move. And then ultimately, the last skill is take action. How do we help young people develop the habits and dispositions so they will take action when they recognize these inequities, and also start to see when young people are feeling unwelcome. So does that make sense? So nod at me if you're paying attention. Excellent, excellent. So I would also say, and I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but I just think it's important that there is no period from a historical perspective in the United States that has not been dramatically shaped by migration. At least no period after European settlers first began to come into this country, and even native communities moved within regions within the United States. But I think if you look at your state standards, you're supposed to teach about immigration at this time period and this time period, but I would recommend rethinking that. There's no period of time when there's not massive movement going on, right? Even the periods in which there are lower number of immigrants come in because of the 1924 Immigration and Naturalization Act, it's still in the middle of the Great Migration, in which 6 million African Americans moved from the South to the North and the West. So the history of the United States is a history of migration. We just don't talk about it that way. And I actually think we should, because I think it'll change the way that we respond to what's going on in the world. And then I also think that it's really important that we recognize that with immigration comes the displacement and real ethnic cleansing of Native communities. So this map that you're looking at is showing you the loss of Native land. The blue is territory owned by indigenous peoples in the United States in 1776. And then you'll look in the bottom in the center, you can start to see the dates in which the land was stolen. And so there is a contradiction, right? Between the freedom that we should celebrate as part of the migration experience for some, but also the loss of territory for others. And we can't lose that. So how do we take all this stuff, right? There's a lot of dates, there's a lot of information. How do you organize this when you start to think about teaching this in the classroom? And so what we decided is we really wanted to develop a pedagogy about how do you teach about migration. And so the centerpiece of this pedagogy is our learning arc. And what it is a way to begin to think about how do you what's your sequence of study when you're teaching about migration? And so we begin with stories. Because one of the things that we recognize is that all of us somewhere, whether we recognize it or not, have a migration story, right? And so the question, I'm not going to throw in every question from the learning arc, but our learning arc is based on a set of questions. Instead of being didactic, here's what you must do, here's the questions we'd like you to explore. So the questions we'd like you to explore here is, in what ways do stories of migration help us understand who we are? Think about yourself. How does your family story of migration help you understand who you are? And then what can we learn from the visible and invisible stories of migration in our communities? The invisible story of migration in my neighborhood is that the guy who ran the Immigration Restriction League, who tried to keep immigrants out of this country from 1890 until the time he died just before 1924, turns out he lived about 2 blocks from where I am right now. That's the invisible migration story in my neighborhood. So I wonder what the invisible story of migration is in yours. And that book, by the way, to the right, is a wonderful book by Juno Diaz called Island Born, which is a really wonderful story for younger learners. And the story is based on a teacher who assigns everybody they're supposed to tell a story about their migration history, and the kid doesn't know their story. And he starts to look for who knows the story. And it turns out the person who is the handyman in his apartment building, he's the one who knows the family story. And so it's a nice shift of a power dynamic. It's a really wonderful book. So the learning arc part 2 is helping us be intentional in recognizing that migration isn't just something that's a personal experience, it's also something that we should think about studying to help us understand. And we've broken that into 3 different pieces: life before migration, the journey and adjustment. So when you talk about immigration, right, that you're only talking about one part of a story of migration. Immigration is like that part of after arrival. Migration connects you back, right? If you're a migrant, you've left somewhere. And so how do we recognize that when you've left somewhere, there's a home, there's a culture, there's language, right? There's traditions that people both leave and bring with them. So, again, the questions we're thinking about is like, what was life like before migration? And why would people leave their homes anyway? These are, again, just a few of them. So I'm going to pick on, who should I pick on? Natalie, I warned you I was going to pick on you. So Natalie, will you read this short piece from Richard Wright? You're muted now.
Oh, yep, hold on. I'm trying. My screen is frozen. Hold on 2 seconds. I gotcha. I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in an alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of a new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom.
So you can think about this very short poem in response to those words, right? There's questions on the side. It's a piece of content to think about, but it's it's also an invitation for a comparison. So one comparison might be to this story. So Carolina, I see you. So I'm going to ask you to read this one. This is from an Irish immigrant. It's a song actually written in the late 1840s.
My father holds 5 acres of land. It was not enough to support us all, which banished me from my native land. My holdings here I can't endure, since here no longer can I stay. I take my lot and leave this spot and try the land of liberty.
So if you start to just think about those questions, right, they would answer different things, right, about why they left their homes, right? And how do, so how do we complicate these stories for people, right? And obviously what I'm suggesting is literature is one beautiful way to do this. There's a great lens of this content is through literature. But I'm a social studies teacher. That's how I've approached this. But the words, I think, are powerful. So you'll, all through this presentation, I've just pulled some primary sources. The second part of this is the journey, right? So there's life before migration and then the journey. And these journeys are not the same for everybody. So how do we help people recognize those differences? So one leading question is, and leading for sure, what do people experience as they move from one place to another? And then the second is, how do borders impact people's lives? There are more questions within the learning art, deeper, but as I made it home this evening, I just want to give you a perspective. So I was listening to the radio this evening. And so I know that I learned today that 138 people died trying to cross over the Berlin Wall in the years that the Berlin Wall was there. About 10 times that many people died trying to cross the US border, and probably many more in the last 10 years. So as we start to think about borders and the way that borders impact people's lives, I'm not making a policy statement at all, by the way, I'm just sharing numbers. So we have a myth about migration journeys that we tell, right? It's one that we often celebrate. And I would suggest we need to be careful with the way that we teach this history. So, we know the story of Emma Lazarus and, her poem, The New Colossus, which is on the Statue of Liberty. The photo on the left is of Italian immigrants at Ellis Island in 1905. It's a picture taken by Lewis Hine. And I sort of wonder, why do humans have response to this story the way that they do now? Because the way that we responded to Italian immigrants in 1905 weren't so different than the way we responded to people who are making it in these migrant caravans, as a photo from Honduras a few years ago. So how do we think about the way that we think about these journeys in the rearview mirror, right? As teachers, how do we help complicate these stories? And how do we think about the difference between this story we were telling ourselves in 1883 in this wonderful poem, and then the recognition that in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. Ed, I know you're here. Ed, I don't know if you're unmuted. Ed is the director of Angel Island. Are you, can I get you to read this poem, Ed? Are you able to hop on?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. So what the poem says is, instead of remaining a citizen of China, I willingly became an ox. I intended to come to America to earn a living. The Western-style buildings are so lofty, but I have not the luck to live in them. How is anyone to know what my dwelling place would be a prison? So this is just one of the 200 poems that are carved into the walls of the former detention barracks, where at least 300,000 immigrants were detained on Angel Island from the years 1910 to 1940, and most of them were from Asian countries.
And thank you so much for letting me put you on the spot. And thank you for, like, if you haven't gone to Angel Island, I mean, Ed knows, like, I'm like an advertisement, but you really should go. It's a remarkable place. There's really remarkable things happening there because of Ed and his staff. So thank you so much for the work that you do. So, you know, we think about those journeys, right? And then what does it mean for the journey then to be locked, right? You arrive, you've had all your hopes, right? And then not to be admitted in. And how is that similar to the story of the, you know, the other myths that we tell about American migration, as well as realities? And how is it different? And what do we gain when we put those stories in conversation with each other? So the last piece of the understanding migration section, and I'm really gonna have to go faster, is thinking about adjustment, because it's one thing to think about a migration journey as just crossing a border. And I think this is what we often lose at as when we're teaching. So much of the more interesting stories of migration is how do people try to adapt to life in a new land, and that dynamic between, you know, the place where you've arrived and you know, and the migration experience, because that's where cultural negotiation happens, right? There's a lot of wonderful tension, a lot of wonderful energy that ends up creating things that are new. So the book on the right is amazing. It's a book jacket. I'll show you. It's called "You Sound Like a White Girl." And the case for rejecting assimilation. I strongly recommend you read it. And if you don't use the book in your classroom, I recommend you find an interview with Yulisa. She talks about how she was a Mexican immigrant, is a Mexican immigrant, and she talks about how she just wanted to fit in so badly. She talks about doing everything that she could to lose her accent. And she was able to. And then this boy tells her, "You sound like a white girl," which she takes as a compliment. But then she comes to think about it. I may sound like a white girl, but I'm not treated like a white girl. Right? And so what did she lose is what she thinks about. What did she lose in that desire to assimilate and to fit in and for her culture to be invisible? But we need to put these stories in conversation with history. So I'm looking to see, there's somebody who I don't know. So Maxim, I can see you. Would you be willing to read this short excerpt?
Yeah, sure. We, the 5 brothers, always speak English to each other. Our parents know English too, but they speak only Yiddish. Not just among themselves, but to us too, and even to our American friends who come to visit us. We beg them not to speak Yiddish in the presence of our friends, since they can speak English, but they don't want to. It's a sort of stubbornness on the part, and a great deal of quarreling goes on between our parents and ourselves because of it.
So I can't help it. Folks, I'm just interested. Is this familiar?
Yes.
Yeah, you're nodding. So what's familiar, Maxim?
Well, I'm originally from Russia, and I'm doing my job in School of Education at IUPUI, Indianapolis. And as far as I see some of the folks in the local community, I can meet first-generation Americans whose parents came here, for example, and they all experienced this thing where their parents trying to save their culture, and they don't want assimilate here, for example, for some reasons, and they keep speaking their native language even with their kids, and this bilingual reality is very, well, let me say, like, interesting to be observed.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think, and it's so important, right, for people to see themselves in our stories that we teach, right? Even if it may not be of the group, right? This is a letter for context. It was written in 1933 by these children of Jewish immigrants. It was written to a newspaper. By the way, they're asking the editor of the newspaper to tell their parents to stop it. The editor writes back, says, maybe y'all should stop it because they're doing just what you're saying. They're trying to preserve their culture, you know, and so it's these tensions that I think are interesting and important that people recognize as part of the experience. I the first time I used this with a group of kids, they were like, wait, Jews were struggling like that? I didn't know the Jews ever struggled like that, right? Because these kids didn't really know any Jewish kids. And it was a chance to build a connection that they'd never thought, right? That they could see those kids in themselves. So then the last part of the story, and I'm not going to go into the details on this because Sasha's got a couple of great stories that she's going to share from this part of the learning arc, is turning to action, right? So if we actually understand the nuances of these experiences of migration by teaching these different aspects of it and using these guiding questions, how do we help young people start to think about the ways that they can take action to make their community more welcoming, more inclusive, better places of belonging? And it may not be an international migrant that they're helping make their community, you know, more welcoming for. And maybe somebody's just coming from a new school, but maybe that there's something that they can learn about when people have been made to feel welcome in history and when they've not, or in the literature, right? And so how do you help young people move from that past into some action themselves? So what I want to ask y'all is just drop this in the chat. Why do these questions that I've just introduced and these resources, why do they matter to you as a human? Why might these questions as a resource matter to your students? And why do they matter to the world? And while people are writing, if anyone wants to jump in and unmute themselves, y'all are so incredibly polite. Somebody come on, unmute themselves and just share a thought or two.
So I have a question. So today at a teachers meeting, we were looking at passages. I wrote up on the chat box, fish cheeks, for instance, and a lot of teachers were really uncomfortable because the conversation was having students write an alternative ending for a literature class to fish cheeks and reading fish cheeks. A lot of the teachers didn't even read the passage fish cheeks. They just immediately went into their minds that this was some derogatory term or something with some ethnicity. And once they understood, they still hadn't read the passage, the text by Amy Tan, but they were very, very uncomfortable with this idea of trying for white individuals, or if you're not Asian American, taking on the perspective as far as an alternative ending to a story, especially when somebody was in the classroom that's either, you know, Asian Pacific or is somebody who is Black, and it's a story. But because I brought in some different kind of scenarios, including the fact that, well, I'm German, so maybe we shouldn't be reading Anne Frank. I don't know, like, help me here. Like, and it was really difficult for me to hear or listen to, because I didn't have a concrete answer, because I could feel the whole room being like, no, we don't want to touch on this. So I just have some questions about how to do that, or if I shouldn't be doing that. So some guidance.
I love the question. and I think it's something y'all want to jump in the chat if people have some thoughts. I mean, what I would say, and this is just my first instinct, and Sasha, I guess I want to hear what you think too, really quickly. But the first thing I think a lot about is it's this wonderful quotation. I'm blanking on the woman who wrote it, just which language arts teachers know and have kind of acculturated right now, but the idea that literature, right, books can sometimes be windows
Yeah.
into a new world.
Oh, who was
for
that?
people, right? And it takes you, and it's useful and it's important for books sometimes to take you out of your space, right, out of your comfort zone, out of your experience into a particular place. But it's also important to have some pieces that are mirrors, right? Where people really see their direct experience reflected. And so I think one of the things we need to be thinking about is how intentional we are in the selection of material, right? And how do we build norms in a classroom? Because sometimes awkward things are going to come up, and how do we allow the space for awkward? Sometimes we're not used to talking about culture, right? We're not used to talking about identity. And that's a problem, because it means when we do, people either offend somebody or shut up.
Mhm.
So I'm interested, Sasha, what do you think?
I mean, I'm hesitant because I don't know the culture of your community or the teachers or the students. So I would need more context in terms of what kind of front loading was there? What are the norms in your classroom? Is there a culture where if a student did inadvertently write something offensive or that perpetuated stereotypes, was there a system in place to address that in a safe space so that it becomes a learning opportunity versus, a shaming moment? And so I think those are a lot of questions that you ask yourselves as you're setting up the scaffolding. And honestly, I think the best prevention would be addressing those in the beginning with students. We want to be mindful of being sensitive. And if you do make a mistake, let's have a conversation about it. Let's learn from it so that we know not to do it again versus assuming that there was any kind of malice intent.
I think that that's so important. I'm so thankful that you said that. And it's interesting because, there's this push in our community, the diversity, equity, inclusion, but at the same breath, it's like, whoa, there's so many things that we could do incorrectly. So therefore, let's just not do them. Right. And I've always been somebody that is like willing to be disturbed and willing to have uncomfortable or comfortable conversations about tough topics. So to have that kind of resistance from going there, I felt like, well, we could say that in so many areas as far as our teaching is concerned. So I appreciate it, Sasha, the guidance on that.
I also think, to go back to the framework for a second, perspective taking is really important. And it would be worth hearing why somebody is uncomfortable. I think we need to hear it out, right? Because I know that sometimes, I'll be honest, I come into a room probably with a fair amount of privilege, right? And there are times when I'm ready to have a good, hard conversation about a difficult issue. And just because I'm ready doesn't mean that everybody in the room may be wanting to have that conversation, right? So how do we think about and hear that pushback too? It's hard, right? It's recognizing our own positionality. I know that's jargon, but it's so important to recognize, who we are when we walk into that space. So look, the last thing that I wanted to just say, and I'm going to drop this into the chat, is that we've been really intentional about having created material to allow folks to design their own curriculum. So this is a really messy slide, but it's an amazing graphic to help you plan. So this is from a guide that we wrote to creating curriculum. And so this is designed to help you start to think about being very intentional in your lessons, in your pedagogy, thinking about connecting content to students' lives in a way that is culturally responsive. So I'm going to throw that in the chat, and then I'm shutting up and going to Sasha. And can I just say one thing? Like Sasha is like amazing because I just like put her on the spot last week and I said, you need to do this with me. And Sasha is like one of those people. She's like a say yes person. So Sasha said yes. Well, you're yes to me. You're yes to me, my friend. All right.
Hi, everyone. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So I asked in the chat for people to share where they taught and what grade and what the demographics and languages spoken were. And I asked that for a very specific reason. I am in my 20th year in the classroom. I taught my first 18 years down in Los Angeles Unified, my first 10 years, which were kind of my formative years as an educator in South Central Los Angeles, and then the last 8 in San Fernando Valley. So I came from LA where my schools were 90 to 94% Latino, primarily first generation and immigrant communities. I moved to Sacramento a year and a half ago, and I now teach in an extremely diverse community where we have Southeast Asian. I have several, the majority of our students are Indian and Pakistani. I have 7 different languages spoken in my advisory alone. I have many of those same first generation stories, but now instead of their families being from Mexico and Central America, they're from literally all over the world. But then I also have a middle class student population, which I have never really had before. And so that presented some different cultural challenges than what I was used to as an educator. But it has definitely been a learning curve for me. So when I first started teaching, I really enjoyed being a role model and teaching in my own Latino community. But what I learned was that I've grown. I've really been pushed to think outside the box and to learn about other cultures and religions other than my own this last year and a half. And thankfully, I've had students who were amazing and very patient with all of my questions that I continue to ask, because I really believe that the best teachers are lifelong learners. And so I'm constantly asking the kids to hold me accountable. If I say something that is inaccurate or feels offensive, like, please call me out on it. Let's have a conversation. So Adam is wrong. I am not a yes person. I have no issue saying no to people that I don't have time for, to professional development that I don't feel benefits me and my students. And Reimagining Migration is not one of those organizations. The curriculum that they have provided me with since I got in touch with Adam and have been working with him over the last few years, I value it because it aligns with my values and goals in the classroom. I'm very clear that as an educator, my first job, first and foremost, is to love my kids, sometimes more than they love themselves, often more than they love themselves, as they're addressing the traumas of poverty and the cultural dynamic of being first generation students. I want them to understand that education is transformational versus transactional. I don't care how many sentences they wrote in a response or how many grades I have in the grade book. I want them to remember concepts and ideas and to feel every single day that they leave my classroom a little bit more knowledgeable, a little bit more respectful, compassionate, empathetic, and respectful to communities or events that they may have not ever been exposed to. I want them to feel empowered. There's this missionary complex sometimes that teachers take on, that it's our job to go in and save our students or to give them a voice. They have a voice. They have rich, complex experiences, even as elementary, middle, and high school students often. And so it's not my job to give them a voice. It's my job to create a space where they feel safe and empowered to voice their experiences and to have those uncomfortable conversations. And I've been a social studies teacher. I've taught every content there is, but my specialty the last 5 or 6 years has been ethnic studies. But I'll be very honest with you. I really loved US history prior to that. And it was a very natural transition for me to ethnic studies. So with US history, I would teach my class with a historic foundation and then bring in a lot of contemporary case studies. With ethnic studies, I simply flipped it. So now I'm looking at contemporary movements and I'm giving the historic foundation as the case study to supplement that curriculum. And so it's important for me to understand, to create curriculum where my students see themselves. And while we want to be realistic about the exploitation and the oppression in our history, I also want to give them a sense of hope and for them to understand the positive contributions and celebrations in their community. So lastly, that comes with empowering them to be agents of change, to understand that they can and should be global citizens, that they are capable of bringing about systemic change. It's not always about, you know, the famous people that have holidays and schools and streets named after them, but oftentimes it's about the grassroots organizing and the masses who helped lay that foundation that, you know, the leaders were leading as they're on the news or as they're making that speech. So as an educator, I personally despise having to wait for slides after PD. So in that interest, everything that I share with you, I am going to drop into the chat box right now so that you can access it. Give me a sec. You are professional adults. If you want to breeze through that while I review these, I'm not going to go into detail. This is not that kind of PD. I very much understand being an educator and it's a Tuesday night and you've worked long days and probably have family, loved ones, or just yourselves to take care of tonight. So I am sharing these slides with you that I have taken and personally adapted from Reimagining Migration and used in my classroom. Now, I'm giving you Google Slides because of the pandemic. I use slides more so than I did, say, 3 years ago. I'm still not quite comfortable having students move around a great deal. We had a super spreader event just a month ago. And majority of our students, including myself, still wear a mask. And that's just simply the reality of education as it is today. So I would say take this, adapt it in any way you like, or scratch it if it doesn't work for you. But this is an amazing case. And I've seen Adam post about it for years. And I wish I had clicked on it and really read through the information much sooner, because it would have been such a powerful tool so much sooner in my classroom. And I think it's really powerful because it's the Supreme Court case that establishes birthright citizenship. And it was probably one of the most powerful lessons that I taught this entire semester thus far. And it's definitely one of the cases where I had the most feedback from students where they said, I never talked to my parents about school, and I went home and told them about this case. And for them to understand the context of the time period where a Chinese American-born man, so someone who would be from a community that would be considered marginalized or without power, to be challenged the system and to win. He won, and be the legacy, understanding that 3/4 of the students in my classroom have this man to thank for their citizenship in this country, and to understand just the historic significance of that, of what he did and how he did it. The next slide. Are there any questions about this case study? I don't want to go too fast, but also, again, I assume this is the Supreme Court case that is.
So this is birthright, not
Yeah.
not dual citizenship.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes. No. This is for birthright citizenship. So that if you are the child, because the argument that was made was that because his parents were not citizens, that he was not, and he would he was not allowed citizenship. So he would go back to China and visit family. And one of the times that he tried to come back into the United States, he was denied entry. So yes, not dual citizenship, birthright citizenship. Okay, and again, take this presentation, do with it what you want. My goal anytime I participate in a PD is I want to give people something to walk away with that they can use immediately and adapt for your own use. This unit, this lesson I have been using for many more years. And what I especially love about the quinceañera lesson, oh no, I'm sorry, let me share this with you. I have used several versions over the years. Let me just, so I've copied and pasted documents. I've made images for gallery walks. There's a couple of different options for the assignment. Again, use it however works for you. But what resonates with me particularly is the idea of youth activism, that these were young women who chose to display an incredible amount of courage, because these young women are undocumented. And so they're taking the symbolism of the quinceañera dress, which is worn when Latinas, it's a ceremony when you turn 15, you're presented to society as an adult. I have some issues with quinceañeras on a feminism level, but as a cultural symbol, I think it was an amazing show of power. Oh, I'm sorry. The class, hold on. Oh, the lights went out in my classroom. They demonstrate an amazing cultural connection, and it looks at the intersectional identity. So not only are they immigrant and or first generation and or teenagers and or living in a border town, but many of them, if not all of them, are undocumented. And they're choosing to utilize the media and bring the spotlight to them so that they could bring attention to the racist nature of these laws that were being passed in their community. And so it's important for our students to understand that, one, they can do something now. They don't have to wait until they get to college, or they have a platform, or they, the people that are on the news, but that they themselves are capable of creating this kind of movement and activism within their communities, and that they can use the traditions and culture that they already own, that they have agency with, to do that, rather than trying to make themselves fit into some other mold or using some other kind of social activism to fit. It's a much more authentic fit. Are there any questions about this case study? Sorry, I'm looking for. Yes, I see a question comment of Wong Kim Ark. Okay, doesn't look like any questions. Lastly, this is one of my favorite, and I've actually adapted this in several ways. This is Somos Más Americanos, is a song by Los Tigres del Norte, which is a very famous Mexican band. And what I love about this is that I think it really twists the narrative that social activism has to be protesting in the street, that it has to be, giving a speech on a loudspeaker, but rather that music, that the arts can be a form of social activism. And I think that opens up so many doors to our young people who, can't, or if you even look at, say, like Teatro Campesino, you can look at acting as spoken word, poetry, that it opens up this entire genre to activism. And so that they see themselves, again, you open up the door for them to understand that they are agents of change. And it celebrates their own culture. It doesn't have to be in English. It can be in whatever language they speak. And in fact, I would encourage that. And I've had students say, well, what if I can't, what if you don't understand it? I don't have to understand it. Can you break it down for me? And that's where you have that relationship with your students. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me show this also. Where you have that students where they feel valued. It's not always about them conforming to the educational school system that they are forced to participate in, but rather understanding that their own language, and I have learned about so many different Indian, Punjabi, Sikh activists from the farmers' protests, from India, from Pakistan, and it's been an amazing mutually learning experience for both me and my students, and I very much appreciate that. Are there any questions? And again, this can be adapted to so many different content areas. I've done this before with science, a science partner who looked at sound waves and how music affects emotions and brain activity. Math, I'm sure there could be connections made, but really what I love is that it just lends itself so authentically to such different cultures, regardless of where you teach. And even if it's a predominantly English speaking school, I would say they still benefit. They maybe benefit even more so from being exposed to these other languages. And I would use different languages. I would expose them to a variety of cultures, because if they're not getting it at school, then maybe you might be the only space where they are.
Sasha, one of my most powerful experiences teaching this song was, I was watching a kid who did not speak Spanish turn to a kid in his class who he knew he did and said, "Can you help me?"
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just natural, right? But all of a sudden the power dynamic is flipped.
Yes, exactly. So understanding that they are ambassadors, and we're not talking about tokenizing. We're not talking about making them the spokesperson for their entire community. We're talking about bringing in their culture in a very loving, authentic way. So that is all I have for you. Like I said, I know it's late. I know my audience. I really just wanted to provide you with something that you could take and save and adapt for yourself. You are welcome to email me if you have any other questions. I'm happy to share anything that I have with you. And I'll put my email again in the chat just so that you can, if you have anything. But I wanted you to have something that you could leave this PD with and not have to wait for an email and not have to wait, for the resource. And I hope that it's something useful for you.
Thank you so much, Sasha.
No problem.
So two things. One is, I really do hope that you spend some time with the material that Sasha dropped in the box. These are all adapted from lessons that you can find on the Reimagining Migration's website. But I'll say this: my goal and our goal isn't for you just to teach the stuff on our website. It's the framework. We're looking for the questions and how do you help students think differently and think deeply about experiences of migration, right? So there's great material by all kinds of folks, from the Smithsonian to Facing History and Ourselves to the Choices Project. The goal isn't just use our stuff. It's the framework. It's the guiding questions that we're most interested in. Ed has unbelievable stuff on the website at Angel Island, so including these new films that'll be coming out soon. So please fill out the evaluation. It's like 4 questions. It'll take you 2 seconds. And then the other thing that I want you to consider is that Reimagining Migration is very much a nonprofit organization. And as a nonprofit organization, that means that we fundraise. That's how we survive. And so I would love to encourage you to consider giving Reimagining Migration a gift. It's obviously that we want to provide these programs for free, but think about it, because our job is to give as much away as humanly possible. And with support, it means that we don't have to rely on some schools having bigger budgets than others, right? It means that we can share our work much, much more equitably. So thank you all so much. Again, please fill out the evaluation. I'll stay on the chat for another couple minutes if anybody has any questions. If not, go have a good evening.
Actually, I think I have a question. when I'm trying to formulate it. It's from my actual case, what we are working with. So as far as I understood, today we were talking about like big migration cases, like moving to another city, moving to another country. But I just wonder about the cases of gentrification and migration in the borders of the city. Because now we are working with the elementary school that is situated in the neighborhood that is being gentrified, or somewhat in perspective of 2 years could be. And I now being a witness of the beginning of the process that some families in several years will be moved from there, and I just wonder about this hyper local experience of migration.
You know, I think that's a great example of the universality and the particularity, right?
Mhm.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And so what I would suggest, actually, one way to start to think about it is that there's a series of, first of all, I would argue that the questions in the learning arc, it sounds to me like they probably need to be adapted down to your students' age. But the questions in the learning arc, I still would suggest, are a useful way to start to think about it, right? How is migration changing the community, right? And, how do we understand why the questions about why the folks have come are still legitimately important questions, right? And how do we then respond to those changes are still important questions. Our ethics and our perspectives might be different. But I would suggest that the questions are written to be universal enough that should allow some comfort in that conversation.
Yeah, that's what I like about today's webinar. So thank you so much for sharing. This is my first time interacting with your ideas, and I have a lot of thoughts to think about tonight and tomorrow.
Well, thank you. I love your university. Say hi to Jeremy Price.
I actually am working with him. He's my director.
Well, tell him Adam said hi.
Of course. Thank you, Adam.
Anything else, y'all? Y'all should just go home and eat dinner. Nothing?
Adam, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I've been listening to the webinar while I've been in the car, so I've missed all the visuals. I just walked in the door, got through traffic. Is the recording going to be available later?
Yes, I will send it first thing in the morning once it downloads.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been amazing.
And
Everything I heard was amazing anyway.
I'll drop in the chat the PowerPoint now.
Okay, great.
So you can
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lily.
Yeah, Lily, thanks.
Thanks. All right, y'all. Really go away.
Have a great night. Bye.
Bye. Hey, Sasha, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Sasha, you're fabulous. I'm reading what Jim has just dropped in the chat. Thanks, Jim. Nice idea, Jim. Thank you. I can't hear you. It's so weird. It looks like I tried to be honest and talk about how I need to raise money, and our link is dead on our website tonight. It's just like that tonight.
I couldn't open the evaluation, the Google form either. I don't know why. I just kept trying to open it, but it could be because I'm on a restricted thing with school.
Well, Google is working. It's not clickable, so you can copy. And I had problems with salesforce.org. It didn't open for me. And Google was okay.
Let me try the other.
The last one works, yes. Adam, that you sent. Yeah.
Or Adam, when you send things out tomorrow.
Yeah.
Put it out too.
All right.
Maxim, I wanted to say something to you when you were talking about gentrification.
Mhm.
One of the things that I do with my students is we take an 8-mile walk and they're like, whoa, what's going on here? I'm like, well, you guys play sports, you do things like, no, not like consecutively, like we're in and out. And so we walk to a neighboring area that's one town over, but this neighborhood has a reputation, a major reputation. But they wanted to rewrite the narrative. They wanted to change it. And so they had artists from Florida and international artists come in and do all of this beautiful street art and exhibits, and there's affordable housing. They're trying to get new families in, and it's really absolutely remarkable. But it's a fabulous way as far as breaking down those invisible borders and just talking about like from one neighborhood to another, from one street address to another, and what we tend to do with marginalization or stories that we create that are just not true. Yeah, there's some violence in this area, and they'd really like to get, some of those individuals out, no doubt. But really great restaurants are popping up all over there, and there's a lot of individuals who are supporting it through art and through like buying locally in that area and learning a different language. And so we've had fun, but where I live, it's that real stereotype of like a wealthy kind of area. And, oh, those people who live over there, meaning us. And so versus them kind of situation. So I'm trying to break that down within my community, but it's fabulous to have this walking time for the kids to talk to each other as far as what they're noticing as well. So that might be something that
Actually, thank you, Natalie, because this was one of my ideas for my program that I'm launching in February, like a walking tour. And actually, I brought our whole team to that neighborhood, and we already had our like inner walking tour with photo and then discussing. And when I did the retrospective, like sharing session a week later, we came up with a very unexpected effect, actually, when one of our teammates, she asked like, oh, and who is actually from Indianapolis and who came from other regions? And we started, and locals, those people who are from Indianapolis, they started sharing their stories, and it was eye-opening experience and heart-opening experience, because we found out that one of our colleagues, she's actually from that neighborhood, and her parents are from that neighborhood, and she remembers about the neighborhood completely different things that people from other neighborhoods were thinking and knowing about this neighborhood. And she said, like, I don't remember all the gangs, I don't remember all that stuff you're talking about, I just remember that barber, I remember that sweet shop, I remember completely different place. And this is the power of personal story. This is the power of personal story, and this is the power of sharing. And I am excited to see what's going to happen when we start working with kids.
bravo, great.
So
Thank you.
I need to disappear this evening, but
Thanks.
You might like the Moving Stories guide as well. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Ed. I appreciate you all. Bye-bye.